What if almost everything people believe about Buddhism today is wrong? What if liberation is not found in rituals, not found in chanting, not found in mystical powers, not found in supernatural visions, but in something so simple and so terrifying that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it, looking directly at their own mind? Tonight's teaching, based on the lecture of Venerable Thích Thông Lạc at Tu Viện Chơn Như on ngày 17, tháng, nghìn, không, trăm, does not comfort the ego. It destroys illusions, the illusion that someone else can save you, the illusion that spiritual experiences mean enlightenment, the illusion that praying alone can erase suffering, the illusion that peace comes from controlling the world outside. Because according to this teaching, one single sentence contains the entire path of liberation. Tâm bất động, thanh, and lạc, vô sự. An unmoving mind, peaceful, at ease, free from disturbance. But here's the terrifying question hidden underneath that sentence. If true liberation is simply an unmoving mind, then why are human beings unable to remain peaceful for even one single day? Why does one insult create anger immediately? Why does one loss create fear immediately? Why does one desire control the entire mind immediately? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, if the mind is still constantly disturbed, then are we truly living freely or merely obeying invisible chains every single day? Throughout this podcast, 3 invisible doors will slowly open. First, what is the real cause of suffering hidden inside ordinary daily life? Second, why do so many spiritual paths accidentally lead people deeper into illusion instead of freedom? And third, what happens when a human being finally stops running from desire, fear, ego, and attachment completely? The answers will not appear all at once, because the deepest truths in life are not understood intellectually in a few minutes. They must slowly penetrate the mind, piece by piece, observation by observation, reaction by reaction. You will discover why the lecture warns against mystical obsession, why it rejects superstition and blind ritual, why it says many spiritual experiences are only imagination consciousness, why craving for comfort secretly imprisons the mind, why anger, fear, jealousy, pride, and desire continue creating suffering life after life, and why true Buddhist practice, according to this teaching, begins not in temples, but inside your reactions during ordinary life, inside work, inside family, inside conflict, inside pain, inside loneliness, inside desire itself. And somewhere during this journey, another realization may begin quietly growing inside you. Perhaps the greatest prison was never outside. Perhaps the real prison has always been the uncontrolled mind, a mind endlessly chasing pleasure, endlessly escaping discomfort, endlessly seeking approval, endlessly fearing loss. And if that is true, then liberation cannot come from outside either. It must begin where suffering begins, inside consciousness itself. So tonight, do not listen to this merely as philosophy. Listen as if your entire life depends on understanding one thing clearly. Because according to the teaching you are about to hear, every fear, every attachment, every emotional wound, every restless thought, every craving, and every sorrow can ultimately be traced back to one question. Can the mind remain unmoved, or will it continue becoming a slave to every changing condition in life? Close the outside world for a moment, observe carefully, and prepare to enter one of the most uncompromising teachings on liberation ever spoken. Because the path you are about to hear does not ask you to worship, it asks you to awaken. There is a sentence that appears again and again throughout the teaching of Venerable Thích Thông Lạc, a sentence so simple that many people hear it, yet do not understand its terrifying depth: an unmoving mind, peaceful, at ease, with nothing to disturb it. At first, those words sound ordinary, too ordinary. No miracles, no mystical energy, no divine visions, no secret rituals, no mysterious powers descending from heaven, and that is exactly why most people overlook it. Because the human mind has always been attracted to what is mysterious. People want glowing lights, people want supernatural experiences, people want signs from invisible beings, people want salvation from outside themselves. But according to this teaching given at Chön Như Monastery, on the 17th day of February in the year 2010, the true path of the Buddha begins in a completely different place. Not in miracles, but in the ability to remain unmoved. And here is the first question quietly opening beneath everything tonight. If a person still becomes angry, still becomes hurt, still becomes afraid, still becomes anxious, can that person truly be called liberated? That question will continue following us. Because the teaching does not ask whether someone has memorized scriptures. It does not ask whether someone has practiced meditation for many years. It does not ask whether someone has seen visions or entered strange spiritual states. It asks only one thing. Is the mind still moving? Because the moment the mind moves, suffering begins. A single criticism from another person can destroy an entire day. One insult can burn in the heart for years. One sentence of praise can inflate the ego. One loss of money can create panic. One illness can create terror. One desire can enslave the whole mind. And most people never notice this prison. They think suffering comes from the world. But according to this teaching, suffering comes from the reactions inside the mind itself. Two people face the same insult. One becomes furious, the other remains calm. The external event is identical. So where is the suffering truly born? That is where the teaching begins to cut deeply into illusion. The world has misunderstood Buddhism for a very long time. Many people believe spiritual practice means praying for blessings. They believe chanting automatically removes karma. They believe rituals can erase suffering. They believe liberation comes from invisible protection. But the teaching in this lecture repeatedly points toward a brutal truth. If the mind still burns with greed, anger, jealousy, fear, pride, attachment, and craving, then liberation has not happened, not yet, no matter how spiritual the appearance may look. This is why the teaching repeatedly warns about the danger of chasing spiritual phenomena. Seeing lights does not mean liberation. Feeling energy does not mean liberation. Having unusual experiences does not mean liberation. Because a person may experience all those things and still become angry when criticized, still become depressed when losing money, still become terrified before death, then what exactly has been liberated? That question remains hanging in silence. And perhaps that silence is uncomfortable because deep inside, many people already know the answer. The teaching says something extremely important. An unmoving mind does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It does not mean suppressing emotions. It does not mean pretending to be peaceful while suffering internally. This point is critical because many people misunderstand calmness. They force themselves to appear quiet. They repress emotions. They shut down feelings. They escape from life. But internally, storms continue raging. That is not liberation. According to the teaching, the unmoving mind arises naturally through understanding cause and effect. When a person deeply understands karma, attachment slowly weakens. They no longer blame others so easily. They begin seeing suffering differently. When insult comes, they understand causes are unfolding. When loss comes, they understand conditions are changing. When pain comes, they understand life itself is impermanent. And because of this understanding, the mind gradually stops fighting reality. This is why the teaching does not focus on controlling the world. It focuses on transforming the reaction. Because the world will always contain praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, birth and death. Trying to force life into permanent comfort is impossible. But learning to keep the mind unmoved, that is the real training. And here the second hidden question quietly appears. If peace depends on controlling the world, then can peace ever truly exist? Think carefully. As long as peace depends on people behaving the way we want, we remain prisoners. As long as happiness depends on favorable conditions, fear will always exist, because conditions always change. The teaching points directly into this instability. A person who becomes happy only when praised will suffer when criticized. A person who feels secure only when healthy will panic during sickness. A person who depends entirely on wealth will collapse when losing it. This is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes one phrase: an unmoving mind, peaceful, at ease, with nothing to disturb it. Not because life becomes perfect, but because the mind no longer becomes enslaved by changing conditions. This is a completely different definition of happiness from what society teaches. Modern life trains people to chase stimulation, more pleasure, more entertainment, more comfort, more validation, more recognition. But according to this teaching, stimulation is not peace. Excitement is not liberation. Pleasure is unstable by nature. Anything dependent on conditions will eventually collapse, and this leads to another uncomfortable truth. Most human beings are not actually searching for liberation. They are searching for better forms of attachment, more pleasant attachments, more beautiful attachments, more spiritual attachments, but still attachments. The teaching becomes extremely sharp here because it strips away illusion layer by layer. A person may wear religious clothing, yet still crave praise. A person may speak about compassion, yet still burn with jealousy. A person may meditate for many hours, yet still fear death intensely. Then what has truly changed? The lecture keeps returning to direct observation. Observe the mind. When criticized, what happens? When desires appear, what happens? When fear appears, what happens? When sickness comes, what happens? This is the real examination. Not ceremonies, not appearances, not philosophy. The mind itself reveals the truth. And according to the teaching, the unmoving mind is not created overnight. It is trained, moment by moment, reaction by reaction, attachment by attachment. This is why ordinary daily life becomes the training ground, not some distant mystical realm. A family argument becomes training, financial stress becomes training, illness becomes training, loneliness becomes training, temptation becomes training. Every reaction exposes the current state of the mind. This is why Venerable Thích Thông Lạc emphasizes practical observation instead of abstract belief, because belief alone cannot free suffering. Only direct transformation of the mind can do that. And perhaps the deepest shock inside this teaching is this: liberation is not proven by mystical experiences. Liberation is proven by the absence of inner disturbance. A person may know nothing about philosophy, yet possess a peaceful mind. Another person may know thousands of scriptures, yet remain consumed by anger. Who is closer to liberation? The teaching leaves that question lingering deliberately, because once a person honestly observes their own reactions, something uncomfortable begins happening. The illusion of spirituality slowly cracks, and beneath that crack, another realization starts emerging. Perhaps the greatest miracle was never supernatural power at all. Perhaps the greatest miracle is a human mind that no longer suffers from itself. And that realization quietly opens the door to the next layer of the teaching. Because if the unmoving mind is truly the center of liberation, then what exactly creates inner peace? What does peaceful at ease with nothing to disturb it actually mean in daily living? And why do so many people mistake pleasure for peace while remaining deeply restless inside? Most people spend their entire lives searching for peace, but very few ever stop to ask a frightening question. What if the thing they call peace is only temporary pleasure? What if the feeling they protect so desperately disappears the moment conditions change? And what if true peace has nothing to do with excitement at all? This is where the teaching begins moving deeper. Because after establishing that liberation is measured by an unmoving mind, the next layer asks something even more difficult. What does a truly peaceful life actually look like? Not in theory, not in religious imagination, but in direct experience. The teaching repeatedly returns to 4 words: peaceful, at ease, undisturbed, without inner disturbance. At first, those words sound soft, gentle, almost ordinary, but hidden inside them is an entire revolution against the way human beings normally live. Because most people are not actually peaceful. They are only distracted, and distraction is not liberation. A person watches entertainment to escape anxiety. Another works endlessly to avoid inner emptiness. Another seeks relationships to silence loneliness. Another chases spiritual experiences to escape fear. But the mind underneath remains unstable. The moment distraction disappears, suffering rises again. And this leads to another silent question unfolding beneath tonight's teaching. If peace disappears when external comfort disappears, was it ever truly peace? The teaching describes peacefulness in an extremely direct way. A peaceful mind does not carry old resentment. It does not replay yesterday's pain endlessly. It does not secretly rehearse arguments. It does not continue burning with hidden hatred. Most human beings live like prisoners of memory. Someone insults them once, and the wound lives for years. Someone betrays them, and the mind repeats the event thousands of times. Even while sitting alone in silence, the inner conflict continues. The body may be resting, but internally, battles never stop. This is why the teaching says true peacefulness means the absence of inner tension. No hidden warfare inside the mind. No unresolved bitterness poisoning the heart. No endless psychological burden. Because according to this teaching, the mind itself creates enormous suffering by refusing to let go. One painful memory becomes 10 years of misery. One attachment becomes lifelong fear. One desire becomes endless restlessness. And the strange thing is this: most people believe this suffering is normal. They think carrying emotional pain forever is simply part of being human. But the teaching challenges that assumption completely. It asks, why continue carrying what already happened? Why keep burning from events that no longer exist? Why imprison the present moment inside dead memories? That question becomes uncomfortable because almost everyone does this unconsciously. The mind clings, the mind repeats, the mind protects wounds as if they were identity itself. And yet, the teaching points towards something radically different. A liberated person does not continuously drag the past into the present, not because memory disappears, but because attachment weakens, hatred weakens. Self-centered thinking weakens. This is why peacefulness is not emotional suppression. A person can remain silent externally while internally boiling with resentment. That is not peacefulness. True peacefulness happens when the inner fire itself begins fading away, naturally, through understanding. And then the teaching moves into something even more surprising. Inner peace is not emotional excitement. This point is extremely important. Because modern society constantly confuses stimulation with happiness. People think excitement means joy, pleasure means happiness, success means peace. But according to the teaching, excitement is unstable by nature. Anything dependent on stimulation will eventually collapse. Pleasure rises, then disappears. Praise comes, then fades. Possessions arrive, then decay. Youth appears, then vanishes. So how can permanent peace be built upon unstable conditions? It cannot. That is why the teaching describes true ease as something much deeper than emotional pleasure. Not emotional intoxication, not excitement, not psychological highs, but a quiet inner stability that does not depend entirely on favorable conditions. A person with inner ease may still face difficulties, still face illness, still experience aging, still encounter criticism, but internally something fundamental no longer shakes so violently. The mind stops fighting reality constantly. And perhaps this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of spiritual life. People imagine liberation as endless, blissful emotion, but the teaching presented here describes something far quieter, far simpler, far more grounded. An ordinary mind, no longer tormented by endless craving and resistance. That is why the lecture repeatedly returns to simplicity. No need for mystical displays, no need for spiritual theater. Because the deepest peace often appears ordinary from the outside. A person eats simply, sleeps simply, speaks gently, lives honestly, keeps the mind light. Nothing dramatic, yet internally, tremendous freedom exists. And then the teaching introduces another phrase, without disturbance. This does not mean hiding from society. It does not mean escaping responsibility. It means not creating unnecessary suffering for oneself and others. Most human conflict begins because the mind constantly wants something. Recognition, control, victory, possession, attention. And from those cravings, endless disturbance appears. Arguments, competition, jealousy, manipulation, violence. The teaching observes this very directly. Human beings create enormous suffering because they cannot stop chasing. One ambition leads to another. One desire creates 10 more. Even after success, the mind remains unsatisfied. And here another hidden question quietly emerges. If desire never truly ends, then when does peace actually begin? The teaching's answer is radical. Peace begins when craving weakens, not because life becomes empty, but because endless psychological hunger begins dissolving. A person no longer needs to win every argument, no longer needs constant validation, no longer needs the world to obey personal expectations. And because of this, conflict decreases naturally. The mind becomes lighter, more spacious, less dangerous. This is why the teaching repeatedly warns against endless ambition, not because effort is wrong, but because uncontrolled craving turns life into permanent agitation. One achievement leads to fear of losing it. One possession leads to anxiety about protection. One desire fulfilled creates another desire immediately afterward. So the mind never rests. This endless movement becomes ordinary to most people. But according to the teaching, ordinary does not mean healthy. The mind addicted to craving cannot become peaceful, because craving itself is movement, restlessness, disturbance. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to self-observation. Every single day, observe the mind, not occasionally, daily. If anger still appears strongly, attachment still exists. If sadness controls the mind, clinging still exists. If fear dominates thinking, attachment still exists. This part of the teaching is extremely uncompromising because it removes excuses. Most people justify anger, justify hatred, justify attachment, but the teaching turns attention inward instead. Why is the mind still reacting so violently? Why is peace so fragile? Why does one sentence from another person still destroy inner stability? These questions are not meant to create guilt. They are meant to create awareness, because without awareness, transformation cannot begin. And this daily observation becomes one of the central practices throughout the lecture. Not observing other people, observing oneself. A person may appear calm externally while internally filled with resentment. Only honest self-observation reveals the truth. And according to the teaching, the path is not measured by appearances. It is measured by the actual condition of the mind. That is why the lecture keeps bringing everything back to direct experience. Not ideology. Not religious identity. Not spiritual status. Just one question. Is the mind becoming lighter or heavier, more peaceful or more agitated, more attached or more free? Because a truly peaceful person does not need to convince the world of spirituality. The peace itself becomes visible through conduct, through speech, through reactions, through the absence of inner violence, and slowly another realization begins emerging beneath all of this. Perhaps liberation is not some distant supernatural achievement. Perhaps it begins in extremely small moments, the moment anger is not fed, the moment resentment is released, the moment craving is observed instead of obeyed, the moment the mind stops fighting reality. And yet another deeper question now begins opening. If peacefulness depends on understanding the movements of the mind, then what happens when people try to silence the mind completely? Can forcing the mind into emptiness truly lead to liberation? Or can that path create an entirely different danger hidden beneath the surface of meditation itself? There's a danger hidden inside spiritual practice that almost nobody talks about openly. A danger so subtle that many people mistake it for enlightenment. The danger of becoming mentally blank and calling it liberation. This is where the teaching becomes extremely sharp, because after describing peace, stillness, and an unmoving mind, the lecture immediately warns about a mistake that has trapped countless practitioners, trying to destroy consciousness itself, trying to stop thought completely, trying to force the mind into emptiness. At first, this sounds spiritual. Many people believe that if thoughts disappear, suffering will disappear too. So they struggle to suppress thinking. They sit for hours trying to become mentally empty. No thought, no awareness, no movement. But according to the teaching given at Chön Như Monastery, this path contains serious danger, because the Buddha did not teach human beings to become unconscious. He taught them to become fully aware, and those are not the same thing. This creates the next hidden question beneath tonight's journey. If the mind becomes blank, who is left to understand greed, anger, and delusion? Who observes attachment? Who recognizes suffering? Who transforms the mind? The teaching repeatedly warns that many meditation methods accidentally push practitioners toward dullness instead of wisdom, toward suppression instead of understanding, toward unconscious states instead of liberation. And this is where the lecture becomes deeply practical, because a person forcing the mind into emptiness often experiences certain symptoms: drowsiness, mental heaviness, loss of clarity, emotional numbness, strange dreamlike states. At first, those experiences may feel unusual or mystical, but according to the teaching, they are not signs of awakening. They are signs that awareness itself is weakening. This point is extremely important because many people become fascinated by altered states of consciousness. They think unusual experiences must be spiritual progress. But the lecture keeps asking a frightening question. If a person leaves meditation and still becomes angry, jealous, fearful, and attached, then what exactly was transformed? That question cuts through illusion immediately, because the goal is not temporary mental states. The goal is freedom from suffering. And freedom requires clarity, not mental darkness. The teaching describes how some practitioners become obsessed with no thought. They force the brain into silence. They resist every mental movement. But instead of wisdom appearing, another problem emerges, becomes bursts. The mind becomes passive, weak, heavy, sometimes even psychologically unstable. And according to the lecture, this happens because consciousness itself is not the enemy. Attachment is the enemy. Delusion is the enemy. Craving is the enemy. Hatred is the enemy. The Buddha did not awaken by becoming unconscious. He awakened through profound understanding, through wisdom, through direct observation of reality. This is why the teaching insists that consciousness must remain bright and alert, not suppressed, not destroyed. The mind must become clear enough to observe itself truthfully. And this observation requires awareness, sharp awareness, living awareness, not blankness, not trance, not self-hypnosis. This leads into another major point of the lecture. Consciousness is the tool of liberation. A human being must use awareness to examine the movements of the mind, to recognize greed when it appears, to recognize anger when it appears, to recognize pride, jealousy, fear, craving, and attachment. Without awareness, this is impossible. And this is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes wisdom over mystical states. Because a person lost inside mental fog cannot truly investigate suffering. They can only escape temporarily. But escape is not liberation. This distinction becomes crucial. Many people use spiritual practice as psychological escape, escape from pain, escape from responsibility, escape from emotional wounds, escape from reality itself. But according to this teaching, true practice moves directly toward reality, not away from it. A practitioner must become capable of seeing the mind clearly during ordinary life, during conflict, during temptation, during fear, during suffering. That requires consciousness to remain alive and awake. And here, another hidden question begins quietly forming. Why are human beings so attracted to mystical experiences? Why do strange sensations feel more convincing than ordinary awareness? The lecture suggests something uncomfortable, because the ego secretly wants to feel special. Spiritual experiences can become another form of attachment. A person sees lights during meditation and immediately believes they are advanced. Another feels energy moving through the body and becomes proud. Another enters strange mental states and thinks enlightenment has arrived. But according to the teaching, none of these experiences necessarily remove greed, anger, or delusion. In fact, they may strengthen the ego even more, because now the person believes they possess something extraordinary. This is why the lecture warns repeatedly against chasing unusual states, not because such experiences never happen, but because fascination with them easily leads practitioners away from the real work, and the real work is internal transformation, not spiritual entertainment. The lecture becomes especially direct when discussing certain meditation approaches that pursue trance-like absorption. Some practitioners seek deep altered states. They become attached to sensations of floating, emptiness, bliss, or disappearance. But according to the teaching, a person can experience all these states and still remain full of attachment afterward, still angry, still greedy, still afraid, still arrogant. Then the fundamental suffering remains untouched. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to practical examination. After meditation, how does the mind react? That is the real test. Does anger decrease? Does greed weaken? Does fear loosen? Does compassion grow? If not, then no matter how unusual the meditation experiences may appear, liberation has not yet occurred. This teaching strips spirituality down to brutal honesty. No hiding behind mystical language. No hiding behind spiritual identity. No hiding behind dramatic experiences. Only direct transformation matters. And because of this, the lecture constantly emphasizes sobriety and clarity. A practitioner must remain mentally awake, grounded, observant, careful. The teaching even warns against blindly believing supernatural feelings or so-called spiritual signs. Not every strange experience is wisdom. Not every emotional intensity is truth. Not every mystical sensation comes from liberation. Human beings are extremely vulnerable to imagination, to projection, to psychological suggestion. And once the mind becomes fascinated with mystery, delusion can grow rapidly. A person begins interpreting everything as spiritual messages. Every coincidence becomes supernatural. Every feeling becomes cosmic. Every dream becomes prophecy. But according to the lecture, this path can lead far away from reality, far away from genuine liberation. Because truth does not require fantasy. Truth can withstand observation. And this is why the teaching values direct awareness over mystical imagination. A person who honestly sees anger arising inside the mind is already closer to liberation than someone chasing supernatural visions. Because honest awareness transforms. Fantasy often inflates the ego. the lecture repeatedly returns to one central principle. Do not lose clarity. Do not abandon intelligence. Do not surrender awareness. The Buddha used wisdom, not intoxication, not trance, not mental darkness. And perhaps this is one of the most radical aspects of the entire teaching. Liberation is not becoming less conscious. It is becoming more conscious than ever before. More aware of craving, more aware of suffering, more aware of cause and effect, more aware of attachment, until finally wisdom begins cutting through illusion naturally. And yet this raises another enormous question. If awareness itself is essential for liberation, then how does a practitioner actually train the mind correctly in daily life? How can awareness remain stable during anger, fear, temptation, and suffering? What practical tool can continuously guide the mind back toward peace instead of distraction? That question quietly opens the door to the next stage of the teaching. If the mind cannot be forced into emptiness, then how does a person actually train it? How can someone stop anger while anger is burning? How can fear be weakened while fear is rising? How can desire be interrupted before it drags the mind away? This is where the teaching introduces one of the central practices repeated again and again and again throughout the lecture. A practice that appears incredibly simple on the surface, yet according to the teaching, it becomes one of the most important weapons in protecting the mind. Newly taki, right reflection, right reminding. Using truthful words to guide the mind back toward clarity. And at first, many people underestimate it. Because human beings are attracted to complexity, they assume liberation must involve secret rituals, mystical techniques, or difficult philosophies. But the teaching repeatedly returns to something astonishingly direct. The mind follows what it repeatedly feeds upon. If a person constantly repeats anger internally, anger grows. If a person constantly feeds fear, fear strengthens. If a person continuously imagines desire, craving deepens. So the teaching asks a powerful question. Why not deliberately guide the mind in the opposite direction? Why not consciously remind the mind of truth? This is the function of newly taki. Not blind repetition, not hypnosis, not magical chanting, but conscious direction of awareness. And the central reminder repeated throughout the lecture is simple. The mind must remain unmoving, peaceful, at ease, with nothing to disturb it. Those words are not meant to sound poetic. They are meant to interrupt unconscious reactions, because normally human beings react automatically. Someone insults us, anger explodes instantly. Something frightening appears, fear takes control immediately, desire appears. The mind rushes after it without examination. The teaching points out that most people are not actually living consciously. They are being dragged by mental habits, dragged by emotional reflexes, dragged by craving and fear. And newly taki becomes a way to interrupt this automatic movement, a way to bring awareness back before the mind completely loses itself. This creates another hidden question beneath the teaching tonight. If the mind can be influenced by negative thinking, can it also be retrained through truthful awareness? According to the lecture, yes, but only if the practice is alive and conscious, because merely repeating words mechanically changes nothing. This point is extremely important. The lecture repeatedly warns against robotic repetition. A person can repeat spiritual phrases thousands of times while the mind remains full of agitation. Why? Because the words never actually enter awareness deeply. The person speaks, but does not observe, repeats, but does not examine, and so the old reactions continue dominating. This is why the teaching emphasizes two movements together. First, remind the mind correctly, then observe honestly. For example, anger appears. Instead of immediately following anger, the practitioner deliberately reminds the mind must remain unmoving, peaceful, at ease, with nothing to disturb it. And then comes the crucial step. Observe. Is anger still burning? Is the mind still reacting violently? Is resentment still growing? This observation matters more than the words themselves, because the goal is not performance. The goal is transformation. And slowly, through repeated awareness, the mind begins recognizing its own movements more quickly. A person notices irritation earlier, fear earlier, craving earlier, pride earlier. The mind becomes easier to catch before reactions fully explode. This is why the lecture describes newly taki almost like a continuous inner protection. Not occasional practice, continuous practice. During sadness, during fear, during temptation, during loneliness, during conflict. The practitioner keeps guiding the mind back toward clarity again and again, and this reveals something profound. Liberation is not passive. It requires effort, conscious effort. Human beings normally train the mind unconsciously towards suffering. Every resentment repeated internally strengthens resentment. Every fantasy repeated strengthens craving. Every fear rehearsed strengthens fear. The lecture exposes this process directly. The mind becomes whatever it repeatedly practices. That is why right reminding becomes essential. And yet, the teaching remains extremely practical. It does not ask practitioners to escape life. Practice happens during ordinary existence: walking, standing, sitting, lying down, working, speaking, eating, facing difficulties. This point is central to the lecture. Awareness cannot exist only during meditation sessions. If mindfulness disappears the moment daily life begins, then the transformation remains incomplete. A person may sit peacefully in silence for hours, but if one harsh word immediately destroys inner stability afterward, then the deeper training has not matured yet. This is why the teaching constantly returns to daily observation. Life itself becomes the training ground. A family argument becomes practice. Financial stress becomes practice. Physical illness becomes practice. Disappointment becomes practice. Every situation reveals the actual condition of the mind, and newly taki becomes the tool that continuously redirects attention toward truth instead of unconscious reaction. The lecture especially emphasizes how quickly the mind becomes scattered. One moment calm, the next moment lost in imagination, lost in fear, lost in desire, lost in memory. This scattered condition is described as mental wandering, the uncontrolled mind running endlessly after thoughts and emotions. And according to the teaching, suffering grows inside this wandering state because an uncontrolled mind constantly creates new disturbances. One negative thought becomes 10 more. One fear creates endless future scenarios. One desire expands into obsession. This is why the practice must become continuous, not extreme, not dramatic, but continuous. Gentle awareness repeated again and again throughout the day. And perhaps this is one of the most surprising aspects of the teaching. Liberation is not hidden in complicated theories. It is hidden in ordinary moments of awareness. The moment anger is interrupted before becoming speech, the moment fear is recognized before becoming panic, the moment desire is observed before becoming attachment. Again and again, the practitioner returns the mind to steadiness, to clarity, to non-disturbance. And over time, something subtle begins changing. The emotional storms lose strength, not instantly, but gradually, because the mind is no longer being fed unconsciously all day long. This is why the lecture emphasizes persistence. The practice must continue during all activities, not only during peaceful moments. Anyone can feel calm when conditions are pleasant. The real examination happens during pressure, during insult, during loss, during discomfort. Can the mind remain aware there? Can the mind return to steadiness there? That is where transformation becomes real. And another hidden question now begins surfacing. If awareness and right reminding can slowly stabilize the mind, then what exactly is the greatest force disturbing human beings every single day? What keeps pulling the mind into restlessness, craving, jealousy, fear, and suffering over and over again? The teaching is about to move directly into that battlefield, because according to the lecture, the deepest struggle is not against the outside world. It is against desire itself, against the endless cravings that keep the mind moving without rest. Human beings often imagine meditation as something mysterious, a silent room, closed eyes, long hours without movement, a person sitting like a statue, separated from the world. And because of this image, many people believe the deeper someone sits, the closer they are to liberation. But the teaching presented in this lecture turns that assumption upside down completely, because according to Venerable Thích Thông Lạc, meditation is not measured by how long a person can sit motionless. It is measured by whether greed, anger, and delusion are actually decreasing. This changes everything, because now the question is no longer, how many hours did you meditate? The real question becomes, did suffering become weaker? Did anger decrease? Did craving loosen? Did jealousy weaken? Did fear lose power? If not, then what exactly was achieved? This question follows the entire teaching like a shadow, and perhaps that is why the lecture feels so confronting, because it removes the comfort of spiritual appearances. A person may sit in meditation for many hours every day, yet still explode with anger when criticized, still become deeply attached to praise, still become consumed by money, status, and desire, then the roots of suffering remain alive. The lecture repeatedly warns against confusing external practice with internal transformation. Because a person can train the body to sit still while the mind continues raging internally. Thoughts continue running, cravings continue burning, pride continues expanding, fear continues controlling reactions. Then stillness becomes only physical, not liberation. This leads into another hidden question quietly unfolding beneath tonight's teaching. What if the real meditation is not escaping life, but transforming the mind during life itself? According to the lecture, true meditation means leaving behind unwholesome mental states, leaving behind craving, leaving behind destructive tendencies, leaving behind the habits that continuously create suffering. And this process happens in ordinary daily living. The teaching becomes extremely practical here. A person who reduces greed for food is practicing. A person who becomes less angry is practicing. A person who becomes less selfish is practicing. A person who becomes less attached to pleasure is practicing. This is meditation in its living form, not performance, not spiritual image, real transformation. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes that the purpose of practice is not to enter mystical realms, not to disappear into strange states, not to collect spiritual experiences. The purpose is to purify the mind, to weaken craving, to weaken attachment, to weaken ego. Because according to the teaching, desire is the force constantly shaking the mind. Desire creates movement, restlessness, agitation, fear, competition, conflict. A person desires praise, then suffers when criticized. Desires wealth, then fears losing it. Desires pleasure, then becomes enslaved by it. Desires recognition, then becomes jealous of others. This endless chain creates continuous inner instability. And the lecture points toward a painful truth. Most human beings do not realize how controlled they are by desire, because society praises craving constantly. More success, more comfort, more entertainment, more attention, more possession. Human civilization trains people to intensify desire endlessly. But according to this teaching, the stronger craving becomes, the more unstable the mind becomes. This is why the lecture repeatedly uses the phrase, leaving desire. Not because life must become miserable, but because uncontrolled desire becomes a prison. And here the teaching becomes very direct. Craving is not only sexual desire or material greed. Craving appears in subtle forms constantly. Wanting to win arguments, wanting superiority, wanting admiration, wanting control, wanting emotional satisfaction, wanting the world to obey personal expectations. The mind constantly reaches outward, constantly seeks, constantly grasps. And because of this endless movement, peace becomes impossible. The lecture explains that liberation begins when this movement starts slowing down, not through force, but through understanding. A person begins observing how craving creates suffering directly. Desire appears, then anxiety appears beside it, fear appears beside it, attachment appears beside it, and eventually pain appears beside it. The teaching keeps bringing everything back to direct observation. See the process clearly. Do not merely believe it intellectually. Observe how craving disturbs the mind in real time. And once this observation deepens, another realization begins emerging. The mind addicted to desire cannot remain unmoving, because craving itself is movement. This is why the lecture says the root of liberation is leaving desire and leaving harmful mental states, not decorating the ego spiritually, not becoming spiritually impressive, but genuinely reducing inner disturbance. And the lecture becomes even more practical when describing harmful states. Jealousy, pride, competition, greed for fame, greed for money, resentment. These are not abstract philosophical concepts. They appear in ordinary life every day. A person smiles externally while secretly envying another person's success. A person pretends humility while internally craving superiority. A person appears kind while secretly competing constantly. The lecture asks practitioners to examine these movements honestly, not hide them beneath religious appearances, because hidden poison still poisons the mind. This honesty becomes one of the strongest characteristics of the teaching. No pretending, no spiritual performance, just direct examination. What is truly happening inside the mind? And here another major realization begins emerging. The greatest battle is not against other people, it is against oneself, against one's own greed, one's own anger, one's own attachment, one's own pride. This completely changes the meaning of strength. Most people think strength means controlling others, defeating enemies, winning competition, dominating situations. But according to the lecture, the hardest victory is victory over the inner world, because the external enemy is easier to see. The internal enemy hides inside thoughts, emotions, desires, and habits, and many people spend their entire lives fighting the world while never confronting themselves honestly. The teaching calls practitioners toward a completely different direction. Observe the mind carefully. When jealousy appears, recognize it. When pride appears, recognize it. When greed appears, recognize it. When anger appears, recognize it. Do not justify it. Do not decorate it. Do not hide it behind spiritual language. See it clearly, because clear seeing weakens delusion. And slowly, through awareness and right effort, the mind begins changing. Not instantly, but genuinely. A person becomes less reactive, less hungry for praise, less controlled by pleasure, less desperate for validation. And because craving weakens, peace naturally increases. This is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes simplicity. The simpler the mind becomes, the lighter life becomes. Fewer cravings, fewer conflicts, fewer emotional storms, and gradually, the practitioner begins understanding something very important. Liberation is not found through accumulating experiences. It is found through removing disturbances, removing craving, removing attachment, removing harmful mental states, until finally the mind no longer burns the way it once did. And yet another deeper question now quietly emerges. If desire is truly the root of inner disturbance, then why do human beings continue creating suffering again and again? Why do people seek outside solutions instead of understanding the law operating inside their own minds? And what invisible force keeps shaping every experience, every reaction, and every consequence throughout life itself? The teaching is about to move directly into that answer, the law of cause and effect, the law that silently governs every movement of the human mind. There is one belief deeply rooted inside the human mind. When suffering comes, people immediately ask, who caused this to happen to me? Some blame fate, some blame society, some blame enemies, some blame invisible spirits. And many people spend their entire lives searching for someone else to rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. But the teaching in this lecture moves in a completely different direction, a direction that removes both superstition and illusion at the same time. Nothing happens without causes, nothing appears randomly, and no invisible being sits somewhere deciding who deserves happiness and who deserves pain. This is where the teaching places enormous emphasis on the law of cause and effect, not as philosophy, not as blind belief, but as a living reality unfolding inside every thought, every action, every emotional reaction. And perhaps this is one of the most uncomfortable truths in the entire teaching. Human beings want blessings without changing themselves. They want peace without removing anger. They want happiness without removing greed. They want liberation while still protecting attachment. But according to the lecture, suffering is not removed through wishing. It is removed through understanding causes. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's journey. If suffering always has causes, then what causes are human beings creating every single day without realizing it? The lecture becomes extremely direct here. People often think karma is something distant, something mystical, something waiting after death. But according to the teaching, cause and effect are happening immediately inside the mind itself. The moment anger appears, suffering already begins. The moment greed arises, restlessness already begins. The moment jealousy appears, peace already disappears. This is immediate karma, not theoretical, direct, visible. A person becomes furious during an argument. Even before speaking, the heart is already burning. The body becomes tense, the mind loses clarity, inner peace collapses instantly. No God punished that person. The suffering appeared naturally from the mental state itself. The lecture repeatedly points toward this direct observation. Human beings constantly create their own suffering internally. Then afterward, they search outside themselves for explanations. And because they do not understand causes, they continue repeating the same patterns endlessly. Anger creates suffering, yet they continue feeding anger. Greed creates anxiety, yet they continue feeding greed. Attachment creates fear, yet they continue strengthening attachment. Then they wonder why peace never lasts. The teaching becomes almost surgical in its honesty. Look carefully at the mind. Every harmful mental state already contains suffering inside it. Hatred burns the one holding it. Jealousy poisons the one carrying it. Greed disturbs the one chasing it. This is why the lecture says cause and effect are not merely future punishment. They are unfolding now, moment by moment, and once this becomes visible, another realization slowly emerges. No one can escape the consequences of their own mind. Not through rituals, not through prayers, not through spiritual performance. This is where the lecture becomes especially uncompromising. Many people believe suffering can be erased through ceremonies, praying to ancestors, seeking blessings from spirits, performing rituals to remove bad luck, making offerings to escape misfortune. But according to the teaching, none of these actions can erase karma if the mind itself remains unchanged, because the root causes continue operating. A person filled with anger performs rituals, yet anger remains alive. A greedy person prays for peace, yet greed continues producing restlessness. A selfish person asks for blessings, yet selfishness continues creating suffering. Then how can real transformation happen? The lecture repeatedly returns to one brutal truth. Without changing oneself, nothing truly changes. And perhaps this is why many people resist the law of cause and effect emotionally, because it removes the fantasy that someone else will save us. It places responsibility directly into our own hands, not punishment. Responsibility. The teaching does not present karma as revenge from the universe. It presents karma as natural consequence. Just as fire burns naturally, just as poison harms naturally, unwholesome mental states create suffering naturally. No divine judge required. And wholesome actions create peace naturally. A person living honestly sleeps more peacefully. A person reducing greed experiences less agitation. A person letting go of hatred feels lighter internally. These are not rewards from heaven. They are direct consequences of mental causes. This is why the lecture says good actions bring stability, while harmful actions bring suffering, not because morality is imposed externally, but because the condition of the mind itself changes. And here another hidden question begins quietly opening. If suffering comes from causes, can suffering also end by removing those causes? According to the teaching, this is exactly the path. Practice means transforming causes, not escaping consequences magically, not begging for rescue, transforming the roots themselves. This changes the entire meaning of spiritual life. The goal is no longer collecting beliefs. The goal becomes removing the causes of suffering one by one, reducing anger, reducing greed, reducing attachment, reducing harmful behavior. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes something extremely practical. Stop creating new suffering. That alone already changes life profoundly. Most people continuously create new conflict every day through speech, through desire, through emotional reactions, through selfish actions. Then suffering multiplies endlessly. But the practitioner begins moving differently, speaking more carefully, acting more carefully, observing intentions more carefully. Because every intention plants seeds, and those seeds eventually bear fruit. This is why the lecture describes practice as learning to live without harming oneself and others, not through rigid morality imposed by fear, but through understanding consequence deeply. A person who truly understands cause and effect naturally becomes more careful, more conscious, more compassionately see how suffering spreads. And this understanding changes relationships too. Instead of endlessly blaming others, the practitioner begins examining personal reactions. Why did anger appear? Why did attachment create fear? Why did craving produce restlessness? This does not mean allowing injustice passively. It means understanding that inner suffering always has internal causes connected to attachment and mental reaction. Without this understanding, the mind remains trapped in endless external blame, always accusing the world, always demanding reality behave differently. But according to the teaching, liberation begins when attention turns inward. Observe the causes inside the mind. Transform those causes, and gradually the emotional storms weaken. This is why the lecture repeatedly rejects the idea that liberation can be purchased through rituals or external worship, because karma is not bribed away. The mind itself must change, and this becomes deeply confronting, because it means no one can practice for another person. No ceremony can replace inner transformation. No belief can substitute for direct change. Each person must observe their own mind honestly, must see the causes directly, must stop feeding suffering internally. This responsibility may sound heavy at first, but hidden inside it is also tremendous freedom. Because if suffering has causes, then suffering is not random. And if causes can change, then life can change. Not through fantasy, not through mystical rescue, but through understanding and practice. And slowly another realization begins emerging beneath everything. The path is not about controlling the universe. It is about purifying the causes operating inside the mind itself. Until finally reactions weaken, hatred weakens, craving weakens, fear weakens, and the mind gradually becomes lighter, more stable, more peaceful. But then another enormous challenge appears. If human beings are deeply entangled in attachment and emotional reactions, where does suffering grip the mind most powerfully? Where do craving, fear, jealousy, and emotional bondage become strongest? The teaching is about to move directly into one of the most difficult battlefields of all: human relationships, family, love, attachment, and the invisible chains hidden inside emotional dependence itself. There is one place where the human mind becomes more unstable than almost anywhere else, not in business, not in politics, not even in physical hardship, but in emotional attachment, family, love, relationships, expectation, possession. This is where the mind becomes deeply entangled, and this is why the lecture moves carefully into one of the most painful realities of human life. The people we love most often become people who create the strongest emotional storms inside us. Why? Because attachment creates fear. Fear of loss, fear of betrayal, fear of rejection, fear of separation. And hidden beneath what people call love, there is often craving, control, and emotional dependence operating silently. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. When does love become suffering? At what point does care become bondage? The lecture points directly toward the instability hidden inside emotional attachment. A person loves someone deeply, then becomes jealous, becomes possessive, becomes fearful, becomes emotionally dependent. Suddenly, the mind can no longer remain peaceful. One small change in another person's behavior creates anxiety. One cold sentence creates sadness. One disagreement creates anger. The emotional world becomes unstable because attachment has become strong, and the teaching does not deny human affection. This point is important. The lecture does not teach coldness. It does not teach abandoning responsibility. It teaches awareness inside relationships, because without awareness, affection easily transforms into suffering. Love becomes control, care becomes possession, attachment becomes fear, and eventually suffering follows naturally. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes that emotional life is one of the greatest places where the mind loses stability. People become intoxicated by feelings, pulled constantly between attraction and aversion, wanting, rejecting, clinging, fearing, and because of this, emotional relationships become one of the strongest chains binding the mind to suffering. This is why the teaching repeatedly returns to observation. Observe what happens inside the mind during attachment. Observe jealousy carefully. Observe expectation carefully. Observe emotional craving carefully, because most people never examine these movements honestly. They simply call everything love. But according to the lecture, attachment and wisdom are not the same thing. A person may deeply love someone, yet continuously create suffering for both people through possessiveness and emotional dependence. This is why the teaching says family life contains both responsibility and karmic entanglement. Family can become a place of compassion and support. But without awareness, it also becomes a place of attachment, conflict, expectation, and suffering. Parents become attached to children. Children become attached to parents. Husbands and wives become attached to each other. And once attachment deepens, fear automatically appears beside it. Fear of losing, fear of change, fear of disappointment. This emotional instability is exactly what the lecture asks practitioners to observe carefully, not reject family. Observe attachment within family, because the root problem is not relationship itself. The root problem is unconscious clinging. And this creates another uncomfortable question. Can a person truly care for others without becoming emotionally enslaved by attachment? The lecture suggests this is possible, but only through awareness and understanding. A parent still fulfills responsibilities. A husband or wife still fulfills responsibilities. A son or daughter still fulfills responsibilities, but internally, the practitioner learns not to drown inside emotional reactions. This distinction becomes essential because many people misunderstand spirituality as abandoning family completely. But according to the lecture, lay people can still practice sincerely. Liberation is not limited only to monastics. This is an extremely important point in the teaching. A person does not necessarily need to leave society physically. What matters is how the mind lives within society. Does the person live ethically? Does the person keep precepts? Does the person observe the mind? Does the person reduce greed, anger, and attachment? That is the real practice. The lecture repeatedly brings everything back to conduct and awareness, not appearance, not status, not religious identity. A layperson living honestly and protecting the mind may practice more genuinely than someone wearing religious robes while still full of craving and pride. Again, the teaching removes all external illusion. Only the actual condition of the mind matters. And because of this, ordinary daily family life becomes part of the path itself. Conversations become practice. Conflict becomes practice. Responsibility becomes practice. Even emotional pain becomes practice. Because every emotional reaction reveals attachment clearly. A parent worries excessively because attachment creates fear. A spouse becomes jealous because attachment creates possession. A child becomes resentful because expectation creates suffering. The lecture asks practitioners to look directly into these emotional movements instead of blindly obeying them. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming conscious. Conscious enough to love without destroying inner peace. Conscious enough to care without becoming psychologically imprisoned. And perhaps this is one of the hardest teachings for human beings to accept, because most people secretly believe attachment proves love. The stronger the attachment, the deeper the love appears. But according to the lecture, attachment often creates suffering for both sides, because attachment wants ownership, control, guarantee, permanent security, and life cannot provide permanent emotional security. Everything changes. People age, relationships change, bodies weaken, death arrives eventually. This is why emotional clinging inevitably creates fear underneath itself. The lecture repeatedly directs practitioners back toward understanding impermanence and karma within relationships. No person truly belongs to another person permanently. No condition lasts forever. And fighting against this truth creates endless emotional suffering. But the teaching also avoids another extreme. It does not promote emotional indifference. The practitioner still fulfills duties responsibly, still cares for family, still behaves ethically, still protects others from harm. But inwardly, wisdom gradually replaces emotional intoxication. The mind becomes steadier, less possessive, less dependent, less controlled by emotional highs and lows, and this transforms relationships themselves. Because a peaceful mind creates less suffering for others, less anger, less manipulation, less jealousy, less emotional violence. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes that spiritual practice must appear in ordinary behavior. How does a person speak to family members? How does a person react during disagreement? How does a person behave during disappointment? That is where the actual condition of the mind becomes visible, not during isolated spiritual moments, during real life. And slowly, another realization begins emerging beneath the teaching. Perhaps the goal is not escaping human relationships. Perhaps the goal is purifying the mind within human relationships. Learning how to live responsibly without drowning in attachment, learning how to love without possession, learning how to care without losing inner peace. This path is subtle, difficult, and deeply confronting because emotional attachment is one of the strongest forces inside human life. But according to the lecture, liberation requires courage to observe even this honestly. Otherwise, suffering continues endlessly beneath the name of love. And yet, another important foundation now begins appearing beneath everything discussed so far. If a person truly wants to protect the mind from suffering, then daily conduct itself becomes essential, because actions shape the condition of the mind continuously. Speech shapes the mind, behavior shapes the mind, habits shape the mind. And this is why the teaching is about to move directly into something many people underestimate completely: the moral foundation of practice itself. The precepts, not as religious rules, but as protection for an unmoving mind. Most people want peace, But very few are willing to examine the behaviors that continuously destroy peace. They want an unmoving mind while still feeding anger. They want inner calm while still living carelessly. They want liberation while continuing actions that agitate the mind every single day. This is why the lecture places enormous importance on morality, not as religious control, not as blind obedience, but as protection for the mind itself. And this changes the entire meaning of precepts. The 5 precepts are not presented as commandments from a god. They are presented as practical safeguards against suffering, a way to prevent the mind from becoming disturbed, because every harmful action leaves consequences inside consciousness. Every violent action leaves agitation. Every dishonest action leaves fear. Every uncontrolled craving leaves instability. And this creates another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. Can the mind ever become peaceful while a person continues living against conscience? According to the lecture, it cannot, because behavior and mind are deeply connected. A violent life creates a violent mind. A dishonest life creates a fearful mind. An addicted life creates a scattered mind. This is why the teaching repeatedly returns to ethical conduct as the foundation of spiritual practice. Not optional decoration. Foundation. The first precept is non-killing, respect for life, compassion toward living beings. At first, many people hear this simply as morality, but the lecture points towards something deeper. Violence hardens the mind. Cruelty weakens compassion. Habitual harm creates inner disturbance. A person who enjoys causing suffering cannot easily develop peace internally, because hatred and aggression poison the mind carrying them. This is why the teaching encourages the cultivation of kindness and harmlessness, not sentimentality, mental purification. The more the mind delights in harming, the more restless and dark it becomes. And the opposite is also true. Acts of compassion soften the mind. Gentleness reduces inner violence. Carefulness toward life strengthens awareness. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes that spiritual practice must appear through conduct, not merely through beliefs. A person may speak beautifully about enlightenment while living carelessly toward others. Then the mind itself remains disturbed, because actions always shape consciousness. The second precept concerns stealing, respecting what belongs to others. Again, the lecture approaches this practically. Stealing does not only mean criminal theft, it reflects greed, entitlement, disrespect for consequence. The craving mind constantly wants more possessions, more gain, more advantage. And once greed dominates, inner peace disappears naturally, because greed never rests. A person obsessed with gaining becomes anxious constantly, afraid of loss, afraid of competition, afraid of insufficiency. The lecture points out that contentment weakens suffering while greed strengthens suffering. This is why honesty regarding material things protects the mind. A person living transparently experiences less fear internally, less hiding, less paranoia, less psychological burden. Again, morality becomes practical protection, not punishment. The third precept concerns sexual misconduct, and the lecture treats this issue very seriously because uncontrolled desire becomes one of the strongest forces disturbing the human mind. Sexual craving easily destroys families, creates betrayal, creates jealousy, creates emotional chaos, creates attachment and obsession. The teaching repeatedly warns that desire pulls the mind outward continuously, toward stimulation, toward fantasy, toward possession. And when desire becomes uncontrolled, inner stability collapses. This is why ethical restraint protects not only relationships, but also consciousness itself. A person controlled by lust cannot easily maintain an unmoving mind, because craving constantly agitates awareness. The lecture emphasizes simplicity and restraint repeatedly. Not repression, awareness, understanding consequence. A person who clearly sees how uncontrolled desire creates suffering gradually becomes more careful, more disciplined, more awake, and this discipline protects both self and others from harm. The fourth precept concerns truthful speech. This point becomes deeply important in the lecture because lying fractures the mind internally. A dishonest person must constantly maintain falsehood, must remember deception, must fear exposure, must protect appearances. This creates continuous psychological tension, and eventually the mind loses simplicity and peace. Truthfulness, on the other hand, creates lightness, clarity, straightforwardness. A truthful person carries less inner conflict, less fear, less fragmentation. The lecture repeatedly connects honesty with peacefulness, because deception divides consciousness. One part hides while another part pretends, and the mind becomes exhausted from maintaining illusion. This is why truthful speech is not merely moral decoration, it is protection for mental clarity. The teaching also points toward another subtle form of dishonesty: exaggeration, manipulation, speaking to gain admiration, speaking to control others emotionally. Again, the ego seeks advantage, and again, inner disturbance follows. The practitioner learns to speak more carefully, more honestly, more responsibly, because speech plants karma continuously, both externally and internally. The fifth precept concerns intoxicants, alcohol, drugs, substances that weaken awareness. The lecture treats this very directly. Anything that destroys mindfulness weakens the path, because liberation requires clarity, awareness, self-observation. But intoxication clouds consciousness, weakens restraint, strengthens carelessness, and makes the mind easier to control by craving and impulse. Many people use intoxication to escape suffering temporarily, but according to the lecture, escape is not freedom. The suffering remains underneath, waiting, and often becomes even stronger afterward. This is why the teaching repeatedly emphasizes sobriety, not merely physical sobriety, mental sobriety, remaining awake, present, conscious of the mind's movements, because once awareness weakens, craving quickly takes control again. And this brings the lecture toward a profound conclusion regarding morality itself. Greetings. They are chains. They are shields. Protection for an unmoving mind. This changes everything. Many people see morality as restriction, as limitation, as loss of freedom. But according to the teaching, uncontrolled craving is the real prison. Anger is prison. Greed is prison. Addiction is prison. Dishonesty is prison. The precepts are methods for weakening those prisons gradually, protecting clarity, protecting peace, protecting awareness. This is why morality and meditation cannot be separated. Without ethical living, the mind remains agitated. Without reducing harmful behavior, peacefulness remains unstable. A person may meditate for many hours, but if daily conduct continuously feeds greed, dishonesty, craving, and carelessness, the mind will not become deeply calm. The roots of disturbance remain alive, and slowly, another realization emerges beneath the teaching. Liberation is not built from isolated spiritual experiences. It is built from daily conduct, daily awareness, daily restraint, daily honesty, moment by moment, action by action, until the mind gradually becomes lighter, cleaner, less violent, less restless. And yet, even after understanding morality, another powerful obstacle continues appearing again and again inside practice itself, a force that quietly destroys awareness, weakens discipline, pulls the mind back toward comfort and unconscious living, laziness, sleepiness, the endless desire for comfort and indulgence, and the lecture is about to confront that battlefield directly. There is an enemy inside spiritual practice that looks harmless at first, soft, comfortable, almost innocent: sleepiness, laziness, the endless desire to rest. And because these states do not appear dramatic like anger or hatred, most people underestimate how powerful they truly are. But according to the lecture, dullness of mind becomes one of the greatest obstacles blocking liberation, because a sleepy mind cannot observe clearly. A lazy mind cannot sustain awareness. A mind addicted to comfort cannot endure the discipline required for transformation. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. Why do human beings keep returning to comfort, even when comfort slowly destroys awareness? The lecture becomes very direct here. A practitioner may begin with strong motivation, strong inspiration, strong determination, but after some time, dullness appears, sleepiness during meditation, mental heaviness, lack of energy, loss of vigilance, and slowly awareness weakens, the mind drifts, the body seeks comfort, discipline fades. This condition is described as mental dullness and stagnation, a heavy, unclear state where mindfulness disappears gradually. And according to the teaching, this danger is extremely serious because the practitioner may not even notice the decline happening. A sleepy mind loses sharpness, loses investigation, loses effort, and eventually practice becomes mechanical. The body may still sit in meditation, but awareness is no longer alive. This is why the lecture repeatedly warns practitioners not to surrender to dullness, not to romanticize passive states, not to mistake heaviness for peace, because true awareness is bright, alert, present, conscious. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes wakefulness, not tension, wakefulness, This distinction matters deeply. A person forcing the mind harshly becomes exhausted, but a person abandoning effort becomes lost in laziness. The path requires balanced energy and continuous awareness, and this is where the teaching introduces a practical method: mindfulness through bodily movement, walking meditation, conscious movement, awareness connected to physical action. Because when dullness becomes strong, remaining still may increase sleepiness. The mind sinks deeper into unconsciousness, so the practitioner walks slowly and carefully, observes each step, feels each movement, maintains awareness through the body itself. This is not ordinary walking. It is training attention continuously, step by step, movement by movement. The lecture emphasizes that awareness must remain connected to present action. The lifting of the foot, the placing of the foot, the movement of the body. The practitioner deliberately stays conscious during each action, and together with movement, right reminding continues operating. The mind is guided again and again toward wakefulness, toward steadiness, toward non-distraction. This creates another important realization. Awareness is not passive. It must be maintained deliberately, because the natural tendency of the mind is toward distraction and indulgence, toward comfort, toward unconscious habits. And the lecture repeatedly points out something uncomfortable. Human beings are deeply addicted to pleasure, not only physical pleasure. Comfort itself becomes addiction, sleeping more, eating more, resting more, seeking convenience constantly. The mind always moves toward ease and stimulation, and because of this, discipline becomes difficult. A practitioner may sincerely wish for liberation while simultaneously clinging to comfort. This internal conflict becomes one of the central struggles on the path. The lecture observes this with brutal honesty. People say they want freedom from suffering, but when discomfort appears, they immediately retreat into sleep, entertainment, pleasure, distraction. This is why determination becomes essential. Without strong intention, practice collapses quickly, because craving constantly whispers, rest more, enjoy more, indulge more. Tomorrow will be better for practice. And slowly the mind returns to old habits again. The lecture repeatedly warns that spiritual practice is not sustained by emotion alone. Temporary inspiration is not enough. Strong will is required. Persistence is required. Otherwise, the practitioner stops whenever difficulty appears. And here another hidden question begins emerging beneath the teaching. Why does the mind resist discipline so strongly? Because discipline threatens craving. Craving wants comfort, ease, pleasure, immediate satisfaction. But liberation requires observing discomfort without immediately escaping it. This does not mean self-torture. The lecture does not glorify suffering for its own sake. It teaches awareness and restraint, the ability to remain conscious instead of constantly obeying impulse. And this battle becomes visible in ordinary daily habits. Attachment to food, attachment to sleep, attachment to convenience, attachment to entertainment. The mind continuously seeks pleasant stimulation, and modern life strengthens this addiction constantly. Comfort becomes identity, pleasure becomes necessity. People fear boredom, fear silence, fear simplicity, so they continuously consume stimulation, and because of this endless stimulation, awareness weakens. The mind becomes restless and dependent. This is why the lecture repeatedly praises simplicity and moderation, not deprivation, freedom. A person needing endless comfort becomes psychologically fragile. Even small discomfort creates agitation. But a disciplined mind develops strength gradually. The ability to endure desire without immediately obeying it. The ability to endure discomfort without panic. This inner strength becomes essential for liberation, because craving does not disappear after a few days of practice. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes this point. Practice is long, slow, continuous. Human habits formed over many years cannot disappear instantly. Greed returns, laziness returns, attachment returns, sleepiness returns, again and again. And this is why persistence matters more than dramatic spiritual experiences. The practitioner keeps returning to awareness, keeps observing, keeps training, day after day, moment after moment, even after failure, even after weakness. This endurance becomes part of the purification itself. And perhaps this is one of the most realistic aspects of the lecture. The path is not presented as magical transformation overnight. It is presented as continuous inner work, continuous observation, continuous correction, The practitioner falls into distraction, then returns, falls into craving, then returns, falls into dullness, then returns, again and again. And slowly, the mind becomes steadier, not because struggle disappears instantly, but because awareness becomes stronger than unconscious habit. The lecture repeatedly returns to vigilance. Protect the mind carefully, because old habits wait constantly for opportunities to return. Especially the desire for indulgence, the desire to escape effort, the desire to seek pleasure instead of understanding. This is why the practitioner must remain awake not only physically, but psychologically, observing the movements of craving continuously. And over time, another realization begins emerging. The greatest obstacle is often not the outside world. It is the mind's own attachment to comfort and unconsciousness. A person may blame circumstances endlessly, but internally, craving for pleasure continues controlling decisions silently. And liberation cannot grow while the mind remains addicted to indulgence. This is why discipline becomes compassion toward oneself. Protection against future suffering, not punishment, not harshness. Awareness protecting the mind from slavery to craving. And yet another subtle battlefield now begins opening inside the teaching. Because even after reducing indulgence and laziness, one powerful attachment still controls most human beings every single day. The attachment to food, to pleasure through eating, to comfort through consumption. And the lecture is about to examine how even ordinary habits like eating and sleeping can either strengthen bondage or gradually free the mind from dependence itself. There is a form of desire so ordinary that most people never question it. They defend it, celebrate it, build entire lifestyles around it. The desire for pleasure through consumption, food, comfort, convenience, endless enjoyment through the senses. And because society treats these things as normal, human beings rarely notice how deeply enslaved the mind becomes through constant indulgence. But the lecture brings attention directly into this hidden battlefield. Not to create fear of life, not to condemn the body, but to expose how craving quietly controls the mind through ordinary habits every single day. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. How much suffering is created simply because the mind cannot stop chasing pleasure? The lecture begins with something extremely simple. Eat to live. Do not live to eat. At first, this sounds obvious, but the teaching immediately reveals how powerful the desire for food truly is. Most people do not eat only for survival. They chase taste, excitement, emotional comfort, entertainment. The mind becomes obsessed with flavor, quantity, preference, and stimulation. And because of this, eating easily becomes another form of attachment. The lecture repeatedly points out that craving for food is stronger than many people realize. A person thinks constantly about delicious meals, feels disappointed when food is ordinary, feels irritated when favorite tastes are unavailable, feels emotional satisfaction through consumption. The mind becomes dependent on sensory pleasure. And once dependence forms, peace becomes unstable, because the mind now requires conditions in order to feel comfortable. This is why the lecture emphasizes awareness during eating. Observe the desire carefully. Observe how quickly the mind moves toward pleasure. Observe how dissatisfaction appears when expectations are not fulfilled. The teaching is not against nourishment, it is against unconscious craving. A practitioner eats to support the body, to maintain health, to continue practice, not to worship pleasure endlessly. And this distinction becomes profound, because the lecture repeatedly shows that the problem is not the object itself. The problem is attachment. One person eats simply and remains peaceful. Another becomes mentally agitated over flavor, quantity, and indulgence. The external food may be identical, but the internal relationship is completely different, and this creates another uncomfortable realization. The human mind easily turns necessity into addiction. Food is necessary, but craving transforms necessity into obsession. The same pattern appears everywhere. Rest becomes laziness, comfort becomes dependence, possession becomes greed, pleasure becomes slavery. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to simplicity. A simple life protects the mind. Fewer cravings, fewer complications, fewer emotional disturbances. The modern world trains human beings toward endless consumption, more products, more stimulation, more luxury, more convenience. People are taught that happiness increases through accumulation, but according to the teaching, accumulation often multiplies suffering instead. because every additional attachment creates more fear, more protection, more anxiety, more dependence. A person needing little can remain peaceful almost anywhere. A person addicted to comfort suffers whenever conditions change. This is why the lecture repeatedly praises simplicity, not as poverty, but as freedom. A simple meal, a simple place to sleep, a simple lifestyle. These reduce agitation inside the mind because fewer desires mean fewer disturbances. And perhaps this is one of the most radical aspects of the teaching. Society equates wealth with abundance, but the lecture quietly suggests something completely different. The richest person may be the one who needs the least, because that person is harder to disturb, harder to control, harder to frighten. A mind satisfied with simplicity becomes light, and lightness creates peace. This does not mean rejecting all comfort violently. The lecture avoids extremes. It teaches awareness and moderation. The problem begins when pleasure controls the mind, when comfort becomes psychological necessity, when enjoyment becomes addiction. And this addiction becomes especially dangerous because it feels pleasant. People rarely notice chains when the chains are covered in pleasure. But according to the teaching, dependence on sensory enjoyment weakens inner freedom. The more the mind depends on stimulation, the harder stillness becomes. The more the mind worships comfort, the harder discipline becomes. This is why the lecture repeatedly warns that excessive indulgence makes practice extremely difficult. A person accustomed to luxury struggles with simplicity. A person addicted to stimulation struggles with silence. A person dependent on pleasure struggles with restraint, because craving has become deeply rooted, and the mind immediately resists anything reducing stimulation. This resistance appears constantly, wanting tastier food, wanting softer beds, wanting greater convenience, wanting more entertainment. The mind continuously searches for pleasant sensation. And according to the lecture, this endless movement keeps consciousness agitated, not peaceful. Agitated, because craving never truly stops by being fed. It expands. One pleasure creates desire for another. One comfort increases sensitivity to discomfort, and slowly, human beings lose the ability to remain peaceful without stimulation. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to the phrase knowing enough, contentment, sufficiency. A person who knows enough experiences stability, not because life becomes perfect, but because endless psychological hunger weakens. The mind stops chasing constantly, and when chasing weakens, peace naturally grows. This teaching becomes deeply confronting in modern life because society constantly encourages dissatisfaction. People are trained to compare, to consume, to desire more, to fear simplicity. But according to the lecture, endless wanting creates endless suffering. No amount of external comfort can permanently satisfy a craving mind, because craving itself generates instability. This is why the practitioner trains gradually toward moderation, eating with awareness, sleeping with awareness, using possessions with awareness, not becoming emotionally intoxicated by sensory pleasure, and slowly another realization begins emerging. Peace does not come from maximizing pleasure. It comes from reducing dependence. A person dependent on little becomes inwardly stronger, more adaptable, less fearful, less disturbed by changing conditions. And perhaps this is why the lecture repeatedly connects simplicity with freedom. Not because simplicity looks spiritual externally, but because it weakens craving internally. And once craving weakens, the mind naturally becomes calmer, lighter, more stable, more capable of remaining unmoved. Yet another danger now quietly appears beside all of this, because even when a person begins reducing material attachment and sensory indulgence, another trap still waits inside spiritual practice itself, a trap far more subtle, far more seductive. The fascination with mystical experiences, visions, energy, supernatural feelings, the craving for spiritual excitement hidden beneath the appearance of practice. And the lecture is about to expose why many practitioners lose their way precisely at that point. There is something the human mind has always been fascinated by: the mysterious, the supernatural, the invisible. People hear strange sounds during meditation and immediately believe something sacred is happening. They see light internally and think they are approaching enlightenment. They feel unusual sensations in the body and assume spiritual power is awakening. Some believe they leave the body. Some believe they contact invisible beings. Some become intoxicated by visions, energies, or mystical experiences. And because these phenomena feel extraordinary, the ego becomes deeply attracted to them. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. What if many spiritual experiences are not signs of liberation, but distractions pulling the mind even deeper into illusion? The lecture approaches this issue with remarkable caution and sharpness, because according to Venerable Thích Thông Lạc, many unusual experiences during practice are simply products of tung thuk, imagination consciousness, mental fabrication, not awakening, not wisdom, not liberation. This point becomes extremely important throughout the teaching, because many practitioners become trapped precisely at this stage. They stop seeking freedom from suffering and begin seeking spiritual excitement instead. Visions, lights, strange sensations, mysterious experiences. The ego quietly transforms spirituality into another form of entertainment. And once this happens, the path begins drifting away from reality. The lecture repeatedly warns that human beings are easily hypnotized by the extraordinary. People want miracles, they want signs, they want mystical confirmation that they are special. And because of this craving, the mind becomes vulnerable to imagination and suggestion. A practitioner sees light during meditation and immediately becomes attached. Another hears internal sounds and believes supernatural progress has begun. Another experiences bodily vibrations and thinks enlightenment is near. But according to the lecture, none of these experiences prove liberation, because the real question remains unchanged. Is greed decreasing? Is anger decreasing? Is attachment decreasing? If not, then the mind remains trapped regardless of unusual experiences. This is one of the harshest but clearest truths repeated throughout the teaching. A person may experience countless mystical phenomena while still remaining full of jealousy, pride, fear, and craving. Then suffering still rules the mind, and liberation has not yet arrived. The lecture repeatedly brings practitioners back toward practical observation. Do not become intoxicated by experiences. Observe the condition of the mind itself, because imagination consciousness can produce endless illusions, especially when a person strongly desires spiritual experiences. The mind begins creating what it wants to see. This becomes extremely dangerous because imagination often feels convincing, very convincing. A person may sincerely believe visions are real, may sincerely believe invisible beings are communicating, may sincerely believe supernatural powers are developing. But according to the lecture, sincerity alone does not guarantee truth. A confused mind can feel completely certain while still trapped in delusion. This is why the teaching repeatedly emphasizes sobriety and clarity. Remain grounded, remain observant, remain psychologically stable. Do not abandon reality for fantasy. And here the lecture becomes especially direct regarding spiritual superstition. People seek relics, believing mystical energy will transform them. People search for sacred objects, promising protection. People chase spiritual energy, sacred vibrations, invisible blessings, special powers. And according to the lecture, this craving for mystical experiences becomes another form of attachment, another form of greed, spiritual greed. The ego wants to feel important, chosen, advanced, special. And because of this hidden craving, practitioners can become deeply lost while believing they are progressing spiritually. This creates another hidden danger beneath mystical obsession: pride, spiritual identity. A person begins feeling superior because of unusual experiences, begins believing they possess higher understanding, begins separating themselves from ordinary people, and quietly, ego becomes stronger instead of weaker. The lecture repeatedly warns about this trap. True practice reduces ego, but fascination with mystical experiences often strengthens ego dramatically. A person starts collecting spiritual stories, collecting visions, collecting supernatural interpretations, and eventually becomes disconnected from direct reality. This is why the lecture insists that genuine practitioners must remain lucid and grounded. Do not use feelings as proof of truth. Feelings change constantly. Experiences arise and disappear constantly. Mental states fluctuate constantly. The practitioner must observe carefully instead of blindly believing appearances. This teaching becomes extremely important because imagination consciousness can imitate spiritual depth very convincingly. A person may enter altered states and mistake them for wisdom, may become emotionally overwhelmed and mistake it for awakening, may feel ecstatic and mistake it for liberation. But according to the lecture, emotional intensity is not freedom from suffering. A person can feel spiritually ecstatic today and explode with anger tomorrow. Then the roots of suffering remain alive. Again, the teaching returns to the same uncompromising standard. The condition of the mind matters more than experiences. Always. And this is why the lecture repeatedly criticizes the obsession with spiritual phenomena, not because unusual experiences never happen, but because attachment to them derails the path. The practitioner becomes distracted from the real work, removing greed, removing anger, removing delusion. Instead, energy becomes invested in chasing experiences, comparing experiences, displaying experiences, protecting spiritual identity. And slowly, practice transforms into another form of self-centeredness. This is why it repeatedly calls for psychological honesty. A truly sincere practitioner questions experiences carefully. Does this reduce suffering? Does this reduce ego? Does this increase clarity and compassion? Or does it increase confusion and pride? These questions become essential safeguards because imagination consciousness easily leads practitioners away from reality. The lecture warns that some people become so absorbed in mystical interpretation that they lose practical balance completely. They stop observing ordinary life, stop examining behavior, stop correcting harmful habits. Instead, they drift into fantasy, into symbolic interpretation, into obsession with invisible worlds. And while doing so, anger still remains, greed still remains, fear still remains, attachment still remains. Then the mind has not been liberated. It has merely become fascinated by illusion. The teaching becomes almost ruthless in its insistence on reality. Can the practitioner remain peaceful during insult? Can the practitioner remain honest? Can the practitioner reduce craving? Can the practitioner live ethically? These are the measurements that matter, not visions, not lights, not supernatural sensations. This grounding protects the practitioner from becoming psychologically lost. Because once imagination becomes stronger than direct observation, delusion expands rapidly. And the lecture repeatedly emphasizes that superstition grows from exactly this condition. People abandon direct understanding and begin worshiping mysterious experiences instead. Then fear increases, dependence increases, blind belief increases, and genuine liberation becomes more distant. The teaching therefore calls practitioners back again and again toward simplicity, toward awareness, toward ethical living, toward clear observation of the mind, not chasing mystical excitement, not worshiping strange experiences, but understanding suffering directly and removing its causes steadily. And slowly, another profound question now begins emerging beneath everything discussed so far. If there is no permanent mystical self inside these experiences, then what actually continues from life to life? What is reborn? What carries consequences forward? And if there is no eternal soul, then why does suffering continue through existence at all? The lecture is about to move directly into one of the deepest and most misunderstood subjects in spiritual life, the relationship between self, karma, and rebirth itself. One of the deepest fears inside the human mind is the fear of disappearing. People want to believe that something permanent inside them will continue forever, an eternal soul, an unchanging self, a fixed identity surviving beyond death. And because this desire is so strong, human beings create countless beliefs trying to protect the feeling of I. But the lecture approaches this issue in a radically different way. According to the teaching, there is no permanent self hiding inside the body, no eternal soul remaining unchanged forever, no fixed I standing outside the law of cause and effect. This opens one of the most profound questions beneath tonight's teaching. If there is no permanent self, then what continues after death? What experiences consequences? What is reborn? The lecture answers carefully. What continues is not a permanent soul. What continues is karma, action, mental habit, craving, attachment, the momentum created by thought, speech, and behavior. This distinction becomes extremely important. Because according to the teaching, human beings are processes, not permanent entities. The body changes continuously, feelings change continuously, thoughts change continuously, personality changes continuously. Nothing remains fixed. And yet, actions leave traces. Mental habits continue. Craving continues seeking continuation. And karma continues unfolding through cause and effect. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes this point. Every thought matters, every action matters, every word matters, because each one plants seeds inside consciousness. Some seeds strengthen peace, others strengthen suffering, And over time, these patterns shape future experience. This is why the teaching repeatedly warns against careless living. Human beings often think thoughts disappear harmlessly, but repeated thoughts become tendencies. Repeated tendencies become habits. Repeated habits shape character, and character shapes destiny, not through divine judgment, through natural consequence. The lecture repeatedly returns to direct responsibility. Each person continuously creates karma through intention, through speech, through emotional reaction, through desire, through attachment. And because of this, death does not magically erase suffering. If greed still dominates the mind, greed continues. If hatred still dominates the mind, hatred continues. If attachment still dominates the mind, attachment continues. The momentum remains active. This is why the lecture places enormous importance on purifying the mind before death arrives, because the condition of the mind at the end of life becomes extremely significant. The final mental state influences the direction of rebirth. This teaching appears repeatedly throughout the lecture. A fearful mind dies in fear. An attached mind dies in attachment. An angry mind dies in agitation. And these mental conditions continue influencing future existence. This is why the practitioner must train long before death comes, not waiting until the final moment, because the mind usually dies according to its deepest habits. A lifetime of greed cannot suddenly become peaceful in the final minutes. A lifetime of hatred does not suddenly transform effortlessly into liberation. The lecture therefore emphasizes daily purification, daily awareness, daily reduction of craving, because the mind carries its tendencies continuously. And this creates another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. Why do human beings continue suffering life after life? According to the lecture, suffering continues because craving continues. Attachment continues, ego continues. The mind keeps grasping, keeps desiring, keeps identifying, and because of this, karma continues generating rebirth. This becomes one of the central teachings throughout the lecture. As long as greed, anger, and delusion remain active, suffering remains active. The cycle continues because the causes continue. And this is why the lecture repeatedly rejects superficial spirituality. A person may perform rituals constantly, may pray constantly, may speak spiritual language constantly, but if craving remains untouched, suffering remains untouched. Liberation requires ending the roots themselves, and the deepest root is attachment to self, the feeling of me, my desires, my identity, my importance, my suffering, my possession. The ego protects itself endlessly, defends itself endlessly, fears disappearance endlessly. And because of this clinging, fear becomes unavoidable. The lecture repeatedly points toward this invisible prison. A person attached to identity suffers whenever identity feels threatened. Criticism hurts because ego protects image. Loss hurts because ego protects possession. Death terrifies because ego fears dissolution. And so the mind remains trapped in endless anxiety. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to non-attachment, not philosophical denial of existence, direct observation of clinging. Observe how attachment creates suffering. Observe how craving creates fear. Observe how ego creates conflict. And slowly wisdom begins weakening identification. The practitioner stops clinging so tightly, stops demanding permanence from an impermanent world, stops worshiping the illusion of a fixed self. And because attachment weakens, fear gradually weakens too. This becomes especially important regarding death itself. Most people fear death because they fear losing me. But according to the lecturer, the greater danger is not physical death. The greater danger is continuing ignorance and craving endlessly, continuing suffering endlessly, continuing attachment endlessly. This is why the teaching defines liberation very differently from ordinary belief systems. Liberation is not eternal survival of the ego. It is freedom from the causes creating suffering and rebirth, freedom from craving, freedom from attachment, freedom from egoic clinging. And this becomes one of the most radical dimensions of the teaching. The goal is not to preserve the self forever. The goal is to end the suffering created by attachment to self. This is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes simplicity, morality, mindfulness, and mental purification. Because liberation is psychological transformation, not mystical escape. The practitioner gradually weakens greed, weakens anger, weakens delusion, weakens attachment to identity, and through this process, karma itself begins changing. The causes of suffering begin disappearing, not through belief, through direct transformation of the mind. The lecture repeatedly insists that every moment matters, every reaction matters, every attachment matters, because each moment either strengthens bondage or weakens it. And slowly, another realization emerges beneath everything. Human beings spend enormous energy protecting an identity that is unstable and temporary. Meanwhile, the real work remains unfinished, purifying the mind, ending craving, ending suffering. This is why the lecture repeatedly calls practitioners back toward direct practice instead of philosophical speculation. Do not become lost in abstract theories about souls and metaphysics. Observe the mind directly. Is greed still there? Is anger still there? Is attachment still there? That is where the real problem exists, and that is where liberation must happen. Yet another profound misunderstanding now waits ahead. Because many people hear about higher spiritual knowledge and immediately imagine supernatural powers, miracles, magic, mystical abilities. But the lecture is about to challenge that assumption completely, because what many people worship as supernatural attainment may actually arise from something far simpler and far more demanding: a purified mind. There is something the human mind constantly longs for: power, specialness, superiority. And because of this, people often transform spiritual teachings into stories about supernatural abilities, miracles, magic, mystical powers beyond ordinary human beings. The moment people hear words like tam min, many immediately imagine extraordinary supernatural phenomena, secret powers, divine vision, miraculous abilities separating enlightened beings from ordinary people. And slowly, the focus shifts away from liberation toward fascination, toward spiritual spectacle. But the lecture dismantles this misunderstanding completely. According to Venerable Thích Thông Lạc, tam min is not magical performance, not spiritual entertainment, not mystical theater. It is wisdom arising from a purified mind. This changes the entire meaning of spiritual attainment, because now the question becomes, what kind of mind can truly see clearly? Can a greedy mind see clearly? Can an angry mind see clearly? Can an ego-driven mind understand truth deeply? According to the lecture, it cannot, because craving distorts perception, hatred distorts perception, fear distorts perception, attachment distorts perception. The polluted mind cannot perceive reality accurately. This is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes purification before wisdom, not information before wisdom. Purification. And perhaps this becomes one of the most uncomfortable truths for modern spiritual culture. People want knowledge without transformation. They want wisdom while protecting ego. They want spiritual insight while continuing greed and emotional attachment. But according to the lecture, genuine wisdom does not emerge from intellectual accumulation alone. It emerges from a mind becoming clean, still, unattached. This is why tam min is presented not as supernatural privilege, but as the natural result of deep purification. A calm lake reflects clearly. A disturbed lake distorts everything. The mind functions the same way. When greed shakes consciousness, clarity disappears. When anger burns consciousness, understanding weakens. When craving dominates consciousness, perception becomes distorted. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to morality and inner purification as essential foundations. Without ethical living, higher wisdom cannot stabilize. A dishonest mind remains fragmented. A hateful mind remains clouded. An addicted mind remains restless. How can deep insight arise from confusion? The lecture asks this question indirectly again and again. People want advanced understanding while refusing to abandon the causes of suffering. But wisdom and impurity cannot fully coexist. This is why the teaching repeatedly connects true understanding with ethical conduct. A person filled with greed cannot develop liberating wisdom merely by reading scriptures. A person controlled by anger cannot reach clarity merely through philosophical discussion, because intellectual memory is not the same as wisdom. This distinction becomes one of the central points throughout the lecture. Many people memorize teachings, debate doctrines, recite concepts, quote scriptures beautifully, but internally, suffering remains untouched. Pride remains. Jealousy remains. Fear remains. Attachment remains. Then what has truly changed? The lecture repeatedly challenges this contradiction. Real wisdom must transform the mind, otherwise it remains information only, and information alone cannot end suffering. This is why the teaching places such enormous emphasis on letting go, releasing attachment, releasing ego, releasing emotional reactions, because wisdom emerges naturally when mental distortion weakens, not through accumulation alone. The lecture repeatedly points toward direct observation. Observe anger while it arises. Observe craving while it operates. Observe pride while it protects itself. This observation gradually dissolves illusion, and as illusion weakens, clarity increases naturally. This is the path toward wisdom according to the teaching. Not mystical initiation, not secret powers, not special status, purification. And this becomes deeply confronting because it removes spiritual fantasy completely. There is no shortcut around ethical transformation, no magical bypass, no mystical identity protecting the practitioner from inner work. The mind itself must become clean. Again and again, the lecture returns to this same foundation. A person seeking wisdom while protecting greed is like trying to see clearly through muddy water. The disturbance itself blocks clarity. This is why the lecture repeatedly warns against spiritual pride, especially intellectual pride. Some people become attached to Nala Buddhism, attached to being experts, attached to debate, attached to proving others wrong. And quietly, ego grows stronger under the appearance of wisdom. The lecture becomes extremely sharp here. Speaking beautifully about truth is not the same as living truth. A person may discuss liberation endlessly while remaining deeply trapped emotionally. This is why the teaching repeatedly values practice above argument, transformation above theory, conduct above performance, because suffering does not disappear through debate. It disappears through direct purification of the mind. And perhaps this is why the lecture feels so grounded. It keeps returning from abstraction back into lived reality. How does the practitioner react during insult? How does the practitioner behave during temptation? How does the practitioner speak? How does the practitioner live? These reveal the true condition of practice far more than philosophical discussion. The lecture repeatedly dismantles the illusion that intelligence alone leads to liberation. A clever mind can still be greedy, still selfish, still attached, still arrogant. Then suffering continues. Real wisdom, according to the teaching, changes behavior, changes relationships, changes emotional reactions, changes the condition of the heart itself. This is why the lecture repeatedly emphasizes satam, letting go internally, releasing attachment, because every attachment distorts perception. The mind attached to praise fears criticism. The mind attached to identity fears humiliation. The mind attached to desire fears loss. And fear clouds understanding constantly. Only when attachment weakens does the mind begin becoming deeply peaceful and clear. This peace is not dullness, not emptiness, not trance. It is clarity without agitation. And from this clarity, wisdom naturally develops. Again, the lecture avoids mystical exaggeration completely. Wisdom is not magic. It is the natural functioning of a purified consciousness. And this purification requires practice, continuous practice, not performance, not appearance, not religious identity. The practitioner must actually live the teaching, actually reduce greed, actually reduce anger, actually reduce delusion. Otherwise, the path remains theoretical. And the lecture repeatedly warns that theory without transformation becomes dangerous because the ego begins identifying with spiritual knowledge, feeling superior, feeling advanced while internally remaining unchanged. This creates hypocrisy, and hypocrisy blocks genuine liberation deeply. So the teaching keeps returning to simplicity. Observe the mind, live ethically, reduce craving, protect awareness, practice honestly. And through this, wisdom gradually unfolds naturally. Not as performance, not as supernatural display, but as the quiet clarity of a mind no longer burning with greed and hatred. Yet, even after understanding this, another major danger still threatens the path, because human beings constantly drift away from direct practice and toward ritual, superstition, and external worship. The mind wants shortcuts, wants blessings without transformation, wants salvation without inner work. And the lecture is about to confront how spiritual traditions themselves can become distorted when people abandon the original purpose of practice. There is a tendency deeply rooted in the human mind. When suffering appears, people want someone else to remove it for them. A god, a spirit, a sacred object, a ritual, a blessing. Human beings naturally search for external rescue because transforming oneself is difficult. And this tendency becomes especially powerful in religion. People pray for wealth without removing greed, pray for peace while feeding anger, Pray for protection while continuing harmful behavior. Pray for liberation while refusing to let go of attachment. This is why the lecture becomes extremely sharp when addressing superstition and distorted forms of spiritual practice. According to Venerable Thích Thông Lạc, the original teaching of the Buddha was not centered on begging for miracles, not centered on worshiping divine powers, not centered on waiting for supernatural rescue. The Buddha pointed people back toward themselves, toward responsibility, toward direct transformation of the mind. This opens another hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. Why do human beings prefer rituals over inner change? Because rituals often feel easier. Lighting incense is easier than removing anger. Making offerings is easier than abandoning greed. Praying is easier than confronting attachment. And because the ego always seeks comfort, human beings naturally drift toward external practices that do not threaten inner craving deeply. The lecture repeatedly warns about this danger. Over time, many beliefs and folk practices became mixed into Buddhism. Astrological ceremonies, rituals to remove bad luck, fortune-seeking, luck-seeking, praying for wealth, seeking lucky numbers, seeking magical protection, seeking invisible blessings, and slowly, practice drifts away from liberation towards psychological dependence. The lecture becomes uncompromising here. No ritual can erase karma if the mind itself remains unchanged. A person may perform ceremonies constantly while continuing dishonesty, hatred, jealousy, and attachment. Then suffering continues because the causes remain alive. This is why the teaching repeatedly returns to the law of cause and effect. No one can violate it through prayer. No one can bribe reality through ritual. If greed creates suffering, then greed must be removed. If anger creates suffering, then anger must be removed. Not hidden beneath religious appearance, removed. And perhaps this becomes one of the most confronting dimensions of the lecture. The teaching removes comforting illusions. No invisible being will purify the mind for us. No sacred ceremony can replace direct practice. No external worship can substitute for ethical living. This does not mean kindness, gratitude, or respect are rejected. The lecture is not attacking sincerity. It is attacking dependence and superstition. Because superstition weakens responsibility. A person begins believing salvation comes from outside. Then self-observation weakens. Discipline weakens. Awareness weakens. Instead of correcting behavior, the person seeks blessings. Instead of reducing greed, the person seeks prosperity rituals. Instead of observing anger, the person seeks spiritual protection. And according to the lecture, this movement takes practitioners away from liberation completely, because the root causes inside the mind remain untouched. The lecture repeatedly points toward a painful truth. Many people want rewards without transformation. They want peace without restraint. They want happiness without discipline. They want liberation without abandoning craving. But the teaching insists that inner suffering cannot disappear while its causes continue operating. And this is why the lecture repeatedly returns inward. Real practice happens inside consciousness. Observe the mind, correct the mind, purify the mind. This is where liberation begins, not through external performance, not through spiritual display. The practitioner must honestly examine, am I still greedy? Am I still angry? Am I still jealous? Am I still attached? These questions matter more than rituals, because according to the lecture, liberation is psychological purification, not magical intervention. This becomes especially important regarding religious identity itself. Some people become proud of belonging to a religion, proud of ceremonies, proud of spiritual appearance, but internally, suffering remains unchanged. Then religion becomes another form of ego, another identity protecting attachment. The lecture repeatedly warns against this danger. True practice is measured by reduction of suffering, not by religious image, not by mystical belief, not by external devotion alone. And this is why the teaching repeatedly emphasizes morality and awareness. Keep precepts, live ethically, observe cause and effect, reduce craving. These are practical foundations. Without them, spirituality easily becomes performance and superstition. The lecture repeatedly calls Buddhism a path of human ethics and direct understanding, not a system of divine authority controlling believers through fear. This distinction becomes central. The Buddha did not ask people to surrender blindly. He asked them to observe, to investigate suffering directly, to understand causes directly, to practice directly. And because of this, the teaching places enormous responsibility on the practitioner. No one can walk the path for another person. No one can purify another person's mind completely. Guidance may be given, but transformation must happen internally. This makes the path demanding, but also deeply freeing, because liberation no longer depends on pleasing invisible powers. It depends on understanding and transforming the mind. The lecture repeatedly exposes how superstition creates dependence psychologically. People become fearful constantly, afraid of bad luck, afraid of curses, afraid of spiritual punishment. Then they seek endless rituals for protection. But fear itself becomes another prison, another form of suffering. And often those fears are strengthened by distorted religious beliefs. The lecture calls practitioners back towards simplicity and clarity. Observe cause and effect directly. Live ethically directly. Protect the mind directly. There is no need for mystical fear when awareness and morality guide life, and perhaps this is one of the most revolutionary dimensions of the teaching. It places human responsibility above supernatural dependence. A person becomes free not through magical rescue, but through wisdom and ethical living. The mind gradually becomes lighter because craving weakens, fear weakens, superstition weakens, dependence weakens, and slowly the practitioner stands on personal understanding instead of blind belief. This does not make the path cold, it makes it honest, because suffering has causes, and those causes must be removed directly, not decorated spiritually. The lecture repeatedly insists that the true battlefield is internal, not cosmic, not mystical, internal, inside greed, inside anger, inside attachment, inside delusion. And once this becomes deeply understood, another realization begins emerging. The path is not far away, not hidden in supernatural realms, not locked inside rituals. It exists directly inside ordinary daily life itself, inside every reaction, every relationship, every choice, every moment of awareness. And the lecture is now moving toward its final and perhaps most powerful message of all. No one can walk this path for you. The light must ultimately be lit within your own mind. In the end, after all the theories, all the arguments, all the rituals, all the fears, all the hopes, the lecture keeps returning to one uncompromising truth. No one can walk the path for you. Not a teacher, not a monk, not a sacred object, not a ritual, not even the Buddha himself. The Buddha only pointed toward the road. Each person must walk it alone. This becomes the final and most important message flowing through the entire teaching. Tu tapduok len madi. Light the torch yourself and walk, because suffering happens inside your own mind, and liberation must also happen there. This opens the final hidden question beneath tonight's teaching. If the path is truly inside ourselves, then why do so many people spend their entire lives searching outside? The lecture quietly answers this throughout every teaching that came before. Because facing oneself is difficult. It is easier to worship than to transform. Easier to believe than to observe, easier to seek rescue than to abandon attachment. But the path of liberation demands honesty, direct honesty. A practitioner must look directly into greed, directly into anger, directly into fear, directly into craving. No one else can do this work internally. And this is why the lecture repeatedly brings practitioners back into daily life itself. Liberation is not separated from ordinary existence, not hidden inside caves, not locked inside mystical dimensions. The battlefield exists inside everyday moments, inside conversations, inside relationships, inside disappointments, inside sickness, inside conflict, inside desire. The teaching repeatedly emphasizes this point. Practice is not escape from life. Life itself becomes the place of practice. A person speaks harshly to you. What happens inside the mind? A problem appears unexpectedly. What happens inside the mind? Loss arrives. Criticism arrives, fear arrives, pain arrives. Does the mind remain stable, or does it immediately become disturbed? This is the real examination according to the lecture, not how beautifully one speaks about spirituality, but how the mind reacts during real situations, because every reaction reveals attachment, every emotional disturbance reveals clinging, and this is why the teaching repeatedly returns to observation. Watch the mind carefully. Someone insults you. Does anger appear? Someone praises you. Does pride appear? Someone rejects you. Does suffering appear? Someone threatens your comfort. Does fear appear? These moments expose the true condition of consciousness. And according to the lecture, these ordinary situations become more valuable than mystical experiences. because they reveal reality directly. The practitioner no longer hides inside theory, no longer hides inside spiritual identity. Life itself becomes the mirror. And slowly, awareness deepens through ordinary moments. While working, while speaking, while eating, while facing difficulty, the path continues. The lecture repeatedly insists that practice must become continuous, not temporary, not occasional. Continuous awareness, continuous observation, continuous correction. Because the mind never stops creating attachment automatically, so awareness must remain alive continuously. And perhaps this becomes one of the most beautiful dimensions of the teaching. Liberation is not reserved for extraordinary people. It begins through ordinary mindfulness, ordinary honesty, ordinary restraint. A person learns not to react blindly, learns not to feed anger immediately, learns not to obey craving automatically, learns not to create suffering for oneself and others. And through thousands of ordinary moments, transformation slowly unfolds, not dramatically, not magically, quietly, steadily, steadily. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes patience here. Do not expect instant liberation. The roots of craving have existed for a very long time. The habits of attachment run deeply. Fear runs deeply. Ego runs deeply. So practice requires endurance, gentle but persistent endurance. Returning to awareness again and again, even after failure, even after emotional disturbance, even after weakness. The practitioner continues walking. This is the meaning of lighting the torch personally. No dependence, no blind surrender, direct responsibility, direct effort, direct observation. And slowly, another realization begins emerging beneath everything. Freedom is not found by controlling the world. It is found by understanding the mind. Because the world will always contain uncertainty. People will still criticize, loss will still happen, the body will still age, illness will still come, death will still arrive. No one escapes these realities. But according to the lecture, suffering can end because attachment can end. Fear can end. Greed can end. The mind can become free even while living in an uncertain world. And this becomes the true meaning of liberation throughout the teaching, not escaping life, not becoming supernatural, not gaining mystical status, but ending inner bondage, ending psychological slavery to craving and fear. This is why the lecture repeatedly returns to the phrase that has echoed through every layer of the teaching, Tam But Dong, Thang Tan, Unlak, Vosu, an unmoving mind, peaceful, at ease, free from disturbance. This is not merely a beautiful sentence, it is the measuring standard for practice. When greed weakens, the mind becomes lighter. When anger weakens, the mind becomes calmer. When attachment weakens, fear begins dissolving. And slowly, peace no longer depends entirely on external conditions. This does not mean life suddenly becomes easy. It means the mind no longer creates endless suffering through resistance and craving. The lecture repeatedly emphasizes another essential point. Do not make yourself suffer. Do not make others suffer. This simple principle quietly contains enormous depth. Every angry reaction spreads suffering. Every selfish action spreads suffering. Every dishonest behavior spreads suffering. And every moment of awareness interrupts that chain. This is why morality remains inseparable from liberation. A peaceful mind naturally avoids harming others. A clear mind naturally respects life. A compassionate mind naturally reduces suffering around it. So the path is never merely personal escape. It transforms relationships, speech, behavior, daily living itself. And perhaps this becomes the final answer to the hidden questions carried throughout the entire teaching. What is true spirituality? Not mystical excitement, not supernatural obsession, not blind ritual, not spiritual identity. True spirituality is the purification of the mind, the ending of greed, anger, and delusion, the cultivation of awareness, peace, and compassion. And this transformation happens here, inside ordinary life, inside ordinary moments, inside the silent decisions nobody else sees. The lecture closes not with fantasy, but with responsibility. Not with promises of miracles, but with a path, a direct path, a practical path, a demanding path, but also a deeply liberating one. And at the center of everything remains the same unwavering message. Guard the mind, observe the mind, purify the mind, live without harming yourself or others, remain peaceful amid changing conditions. And little by little, the chains of suffering begin falling away, not because someone saves you, but because wisdom finally awakens within your own direct experience. The torch was never outside, it was waiting to be lit within.